I'm pleased to present Sega's views on how we can best ensure that all consumers, especially parents, have the information they need to make appropriate choices among interactive video products for their family. In recent days, the glare of the media's spotlight on this issue has resulted in the circulation of a number of distorted and inaccurate claims. The most damaging of these distortions, in my view, is the notion that Sega and the rest of the digital interactive industry are only in the business of selling games to children. This is not the case. Yes, many of Sega's interactive video titles are intended and purchased for young children. Many other Sega titles, however, are intended for and purchased by adults for their personal entertainment and education. As you can see, evolving interactive technology has spawned a huge market that goes well beyond the child-oriented directed titles that gave the industry its start. Clearly, whatever Congress might do would affect a large, diverse group of consumers, young and old, in a volatile industry only in its infancy. Information, not regulation, is the appropriate policy. Last September...
It's kind of a bit unfair to say that video game censorship is only a topical discussion in recent years, because a lot of publishers have to deal with the same amount of governments, activists, and executive decisions that sabotage the original intent of the product as much as they do today. But at least it's not as bad as it used to be after we got past the 90s Puritan filter. That being said, when I see recent discussions about censorship, I feel like a part of what the movement is meant to be has been somewhat recontextualized into a trivial euphemism for people that get way too upset about a character not being fuckable. Since I want to make sure that we are all on the same page here, for me, a game getting censored means that a game was just barred from production or completely altered by demand of an official body that regulates what gets broadcast. And despite the connotation this description gives when you hear that, I don't think censorship is malicious, because censorship is as dubious as the idea of how we interpret free speech. Just like how, despite you having that right to speak, doesn't give you the okay to say a racial slur, something being censored doesn't mean that it's intentionally done to kill art. Like it or not, people had to fight for this to be a thing so that we could allow game developers to create things that they would have been barred from making. I think a lot of people would have preferred anything that has its issues over one that would have turned every game into little Einsteins on the Game Boy Advance. But I think there is a lot of misinformation about how we should be looking at censorship in a modern perspective, where you get one side that is just upset if anything gets changed, while the other is trying to abuse the system to call a trans mask a pedophile. So really, there just needs to be a lot more education on what censorship is actually like, or more appropriately, how censorship can be used for an ulterior motive. Since we need something to start off with, and this is probably not the kind of video that is going to be doing a great job handling this discussion with grace, it's kind of ridiculous to be trying to censor something that has explicit themes or trying to make something a little controversial, because if you take that away, you kinda don't have a game. Kind of like removing the gore out of Mortal Kombat, then like, what do you have left? I'm also hesitant to say that these kinds of games get censored if they aren't just sold on major gaming platforms, since the digital market completely changed how games get distributed altogether, or in some cases they're regulated outside of the ESRB, like itch.io's proprietary rating system. The interesting thing about these types of games is that they aren't really banned, but they aren't entitled to a platform with a built-in audience either. You can push the boundaries of artistic representation, but you aren't going to be pushing the boundaries of the publisher's storefront if you aren't going to be playing by their rules. For most of the cases here, if you want to pull an Andy Warhol, you have to be a little creative with how you deploy it. Now, some people found out that if you want to have your content released without the fear of being scrutinized for it, you can take your game to some site designed for that artistic demand without the fear of censorship, like Newgrounds.
Do I smell kitty litter?
If you happen to be a netlore enthusiast, you probably might already know where I'm about to go with this, but let's cover some stuff before we get to that point. So, a site like Newgrounds takes pride in its priority of artistic intent over its own well-being. Ross Snyder, the back-end developer for Newgrounds and a well-known admin at the time, expressed his own take on what made Newgrounds such a great place for artists. When Tom Folt first started the site many years ago, it was a place for his personal creations, some of which were too edgy for the mainstream. Many of his productions pushed the limits of good taste, but he published them nevertheless, and they found an audience. It turned out that a lot of other people didn't really have an outlet for their not fit for the mainstream creativity, and Newgrounds evolved from a showcase for Tom's work into a showcase for everyone's work, free from the usual moral judgment and censorship. Newgrounds found its niche and flourished, and today we have one of the most unique communities on the internet. We're a place where you can find polished, professional quality animations and games, as well as creations that are more coarse, more personal, more anything goes, and everybody's welcome. This quote was in response to the release of VTech Rampage. When you look at a game that tries to bank on a national tragedy, there's a fine line to be treading to be arguing that this is a work that needs to be hosted on a massive platform. And for the case of Newgrounds, they chose to stick to ideals even at the cost of their own platform. Which is admirable, but even they have their limits and know that decisions like these are hard for everybody. Ideals are great to have as a leader for a platform meant for artists, but the big ideal on top of everything else that we tend to leave out when talking about this is survivability. Ideals don't mean jack squat if you don't have a site to ensure they stay a part of it, and when the guy you just defended goes out and makes another fucking school shooter game about the Sandy Hook massacre, you kinda have to take that hit. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly if we're going to be honest here, video games about school shootings kinda just didn't stop showing up. And given that they aren't meant to be rage bait like VTech Rampage, it's very obvious that people want to have a conversation about that kind of terror. That said, when big studios like Ubisoft make these kinds of conversations with Rainbow Six's Article 5 scenario, or when Ready or Not try to recreate the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting, and by try to, I mean got hit with a trademark infringement because of how closely related it was to the incident, while it tries to seem like it wants to have that conversation, it usually ends with them just not having the conversation, because that wasn't why they put the scenario in there. It was there to make you feel good for stopping the atrocity. That's not to say that these games couldn't handle these subjects because the game was designed to be fun first, then authentic afterwards. You could totally make these games do a really good job opening up that conversation if they wanted to, but what makes the difference is whether or not it even bothered to create that environment to have that conversation is what I'm trying to say here. Is the inclusion of these atrocities here because they wanted to have a conversation? Or was it just there to be competence porn? I understand that when you make a game stop to make you ask how you feel about it, that sounds really lame on paper, but the act of putting the incident in your game for the sake of wanting a school shooter incident in your game is only a small morsel of the conversation, while the rest is just left to the side to have a super cop moment. That's not a conversation, and it's especially not a brave attempt at a conversation either. Saying a school shooting is bad is the easiest thing you could have ever said because it is universally agreed to be evil. But addressing the root of that evil is a very hard and uncomfortable discussion about the culture we live in. And yet, when it comes time to talk about it, the conversation only goes as far as the actual incident and then just drops the subject. School shootings can have discussions decades after they happen because, unfortunately, they happen more now than way back then when something like that was considered unthinkable. And now some jackass wants to use that to sell a video game, but rather than being rightfully called out for it like Super Columbine was, it's basically praised for doing the bare minimum simply because it didn't have to make the player think. There's so much more I could talk about, especially since I'm talking about Newgrounds and haven't even had a chance to bring up Shadman. But I'd have to digress from this discussion for now, since I want to ease up the conversation a bit. But if you want to know more about VTech Rampage and other games that Newgrounds had to handle regarding the act of censorship, I included a link on the Netlore podcast where I got most of the info on that in the description.
When you watch a video of like a horrific event, like that makes you feel bad, but like to put yourself in like the simulated role of the gunman, like that really, I don't know, that just affects the way you think about it. And I just think people can't get over the fact that it's a game because why? Because games are games. They're supposed to be fun. They're supposed to be lighthearted. So you can't make a game about something that serious. You know what I mean? Like it just rubs people the wrong way before they know anything about it. And like, it doesn't matter, you know?
And I guess to be fair, VTech Rampage poisoned a lot of the goodwill he would have had.
It's the same guy, right? It's so crazy.
In the past, I made the mistake of thinking that video games were supposed to be fun. My naive younger self foolishly played Grand Theft Auto with a smile on my face as I plowed through pedestrians on the sidewalk.
I think that much like a lot of other internet protests out there are a lot of people in that kind of crowd who are acting in their own personal interest and might not actually agree with everything the leaders are saying. This is kind of important given that a lot of the policies these big names you hear when this topic is brought up tends to be a contradiction. Like, for example, their take on censorship. Given the nature of their overarching narrative, I'm actually surprised that a lot of people don't realize that the anti-woke movement is pro-censorship when the grand objective is to remove their definition of woke from the gaming industry, which is by definition an act of censorship.
What do you mean by that?
Now, the reason why I think the whole idea of DEI is the sole reason a game failed is kind of baloney here, is that regardless of your personal experience, either as a consumer or even a game developer, unless you were told by someone who worked on the game or can read minds, there is no possible way for you to have known that without working on the game to know what the leads were prioritizing. Of course, that's not the point here. The point is that DEI was a scapegoat for the conversation to make it sound like they just don't like how representation is being implemented, when it could just be a thing that we know to be true. Cue the Morgan Freeman clip.
How are we going to get rid of racism until... Stop talking about it.
But as it turns out, when you give these people a microphone and a 2-hour podcast to talk amongst themselves, they just turn out to be literally everything their critics call them.
By the way, if you're like a British, like, black person, like, why... I'm sorry. I have no black person to bounce this off of.
Yeah,
why are you wearing
black?
like your
No
Rafiki or
because he's leaning.
Yeah, you're right. He's wearing
why
this sort of like
the thing? Why are you wearing the cape? The side
like, oh, I got my Kwanzaa costume on.
Sammy, his
yeah,
game is
exactly. Why are you wearing the Kwanzaa
his
thing?
game is based off of his culture, and he's leaning heavy into it too.
But he doesn't know his culture.
While speaking in an accent that's more English than mine.
I don't know if he knows his culture, but
I'm going to copy off of Kim Belair for a second here and say that most of the issue we can point out from this movement is that we set a definition for what is normal a long time ago, and that makes representation a deviation from normal. When something that was made to talk about something outside of your own culture that isn't just white guy but in a European country, it can tend to come off like it wasn't meant for someone else, or for some cases like the art community, people will just outright be hostile to people who attempt to make representation outside of the artist's own upbringing, which discourages even further attempts to even get more of that kind of work out to the public. And from what I've seen by these consultants that people complain about all the time, that's not really what they want to happen to art.
But I thought here, this was an opportunity for innovation. Here we had the chance to make a woman who has been victimized see herself in a game, be able to express something to another woman in a game, and kind of actually relate to it. And we had that opportunity, but instead we pulled back because we thought it was safer not to push forward. And after the whole thing was done, the team thanked me again, and they said, like, thanks so much, you really mitigated the risk. But I think when we do that kind of work and we make it seem like what we're doing is, you know, being very careful, being very scared, we end up just kind of sanding down all the rough edges instead of building something new and building something out. And that means that we feel daunted when we discuss representation because we talk a lot about representation as the mitigation of pain, but we don't talk about representation as a creator of joy.
These people are with you and they want to make games better, but obviously they have their name attached to a game that did really poorly, and rather than look at the team that proposed the game that was obviously going to piss some people off, these critics chose to blame it all on the studio Rocksteady hired to write some parts of the game, at a time when Warner Brothers was kind of shitting the bed by putting all their money in streaming, and they needed all their shit they owned to try to cover the cost, which might have also been a major factor towards why this game didn't do so well. Sweet Baby Inc. did not make the game. They didn't make the developers change the gameplay to be a third-person Fortnite clone. They didn't make the developers implement the live service elements. They didn't design the boring-ass gameplay loop, and they especially didn't make the decision to kill off their favorite characters. But when the game came out, everything people were talking about for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League was that Sweet Baby Inc. made the game this way because they couldn't accept that the same studio that gave us Arkham Knight would have ever made something like this. Except they fucking did. So, now, I'm just kind of stuck with one more question that's been in my head since I started working on this video. What made the discussion of censorship so fucking bad? One theory I have that kind of makes sense the more I think about it is that some companies have found that controversy can sell products, so they can intentionally use rage bait to get some media attention to sell products, while treating the controversy as a ploy to get it censored when there was no actual threat to the product. A game like GTA is one of the most controversial games out there that you can still go out on a major platform and still buy, and Lord knows that people have been spending years trying to get that game taken down. At one point in its lifetime, the franchise has been trying its hardest to be more than what its critics want to label it as, and if you want to consider that a bad thing, let's agree to disagree. I think that a lot of companies caught on to how well these games did after basically being the poster child of an entire discussion post-2010, and as a businessman in your big business suit, it would make sense to cash in on that if you know that as long as Rockstar doesn't get hit for it, you won't either. Is there actual proof that this was what Infinity Ward was thinking when they made No Russian? Or when the Medal of Honor reboot allowed you to play as the Taliban in multiplayer? Probably not. But by all accounts, a AAA game studio should know better than to intentionally take that risk if they knew it might kill the product they already spent so much to make. Controversies can permanently scar the reputation of your studio for decades after an isolated incident that was blown to a national scale. And yet a game where you get to participate in a mass shooting on a comically bad technicality that you're a CIA plant is regarded as one of the best games of the early 2000s era of video gaming. So maybe there's some truth in that argument. Another theory is that the conversation of censorship is political, and gamers have made it very clear that they don't want to talk politics, if it's not their politics. I say that because a lot of these keep politics out of video games bunch, if you look at them long enough, are going to have very strong opinions about politics, despite the front of apathy. They care a lot, and it reflects on how, when it comes time to talk about actually keeping politics out of video games, it's never about the actual rejection of any element of politics when it's a modern tactical shooter, Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear Solid, Fallout, or another Yakuza game. But when a game tries to handle identity politics by making a main character black, then politics are why the gaming industry is just going to shit. For this conversation though, you're gonna see the word woke a lot. And since we've got time to spare and nobody seems to be able to fucking define this word even though we are supposed to know it, what does woke even mean? It's been a flexible term usually meant to be for awareness of social inequity that dates back to the 1930s, where one early use of it was a part of a song from Huddie Ledbetter singing about the Scottsboro boys.
That is all it was to it. They just saw the women. They didn't see nothing else wrong. But anyhow, they put the boys in jail, and in that 6 long years, well, the state, all the whole United States got together, and they got out 4 of them, and they come to New York. And the lawyer what got him out, I know him pretty good. I've met him. And he showed me the Scottsboro boys, and I shake hands with him, so I made this little song about down there. So I advise everybody to be a little careful when they go along through that, but stay woke, keep their eyes open.
The term would go around here and there to include some more groups of people and would go on to adapt to its most modern definition around 2015 to be a catch-all for political issues from the left wing of American politics. Then around 2019, it became a pejorative term to describe performative activism for the sake of social capital. You know, the Gillette Boys Will Be Boys ad or the Pepsi protest. It's the idea that identity politics is like a bag of Doritos. Now, regardless of all this time that I spent talking about this particular section of this video, I think the point that I need to make is you cannot be claiming that you're not a political movement, or at least trying to argue that you're against politics, while also at the same time attaching to yourself one of the most divisive discussions in the past 5 years that originates from a political context. Now, while I do think that the recent outcry of modern examples usually suck ass, does that mean that censorship in recent years just don't happen? Obviously not. I can give you like several examples of games that got censored in the past couple years, like Mario Kart 8 changing an arm pose since it was a vulgar expression in other countries to mean up yours. Baldur's Gate 3 in Japan took out a goblin torture scene and the more explicit scenes in the game. Counter-Strike Global Offensive in China had to make their own proprietary version of the game called the Perfect World Edition back in 2017, and it would change large parts of the game from the hammer and sickle in Cache to Monastery being outright removed from the map pool for being a location in Tibet. Censorship can even come outside of the medium as well, such as in 2019 when Blitzchung, a professional Hearthstone player along with the casters, were famously banned from play after the player said "Liberate Hong Kong" on a livestream. Some countries will even just outright refuse to sell their games if it includes even the slightest mention of the LGBT community or force the developers to make a version without that content. Censorship is still currently an issue, and as long as we have a governing body that tries to dictate what should and should not be allowed to be viewed, we are always going to be having a talking about censorship. But we aren't going to be going anywhere if we keep hyper-fixating on the same 2 fucking discussions because you want to fight a pointless culture war. Unfortunately, this discussion is going to be a vastly political one here because it's going to be about how a government body is supposed to regulate things, and censorship isn't exactly the top policy change in the Oval Office right now. The sooner gamers can realize that, the faster we can get to providing a better solution that isn't just going to get lobbied out of existence every time we try to fix it. And it can't just be continuing to harass the developers when they do make the changes. It's fine to be mad when you get sold something and then you get something else, but what possibly could have ever made you dare to think that this was the developer's choice and not the people that decide whether or not your game can even be sold in stores? Focus on the problem. not the people who have to follow the regulations. Another thing you can do is raise awareness about censorship outside of your own country. The United States have been fairly aggressive with their censors, but at the very least, we had a chance to even fight them before they had any meaningful impact. In other countries, the discussion is not even a factor since the government already answered for you. It helps with the other fact that the current discussion has grown stale by an ethnocentric view of what censorship is, so being able to explore a little bit more about what censorship means outside of your own country can allow you to see what may have been attempted before to even push that boundary in a seemingly impossible scenario. And the only final thing you need to consider is that you have to separate yourself as far away from the people who want to use your concerns to start a fight. If you see it, don't even give them the pleasure of interaction. Their entire power rests on the fact that you keep responding to them. It's an unfortunate truth, but you're not going to be convincing everybody on the internet to change, especially when their stance on the ideal industry is to keep politics out of my video games. And if they don't want to talk about politics, then I guess we just give them what they want. We exclude their opinions so that they don't have to deal with politics like they wanted. If their solution to every problem is to mindlessly use otherwise legitimate protesting to start shit with employees, or loudly declare that you will never play the game until you fix it, only to just play it a couple months later, then they weren't really there to fix the problem in the first place, and were just grifting off a legitimate public issue. I do think that the whole video so far was just downplaying the whole discussion here, but it's actually a really big deal of how we are supposed to interpret censorship moving on forward, because the way we have been doing it, in my honest opinion, is god-awful, and it's not good for us if the topic gets brought up again after a time where we can't get our shit together. Some of you might have seen that video from 2019 that was incorrectly cited to be a recent one where Donald Trump was trying to revive this discussion, as he was relaying the same violence in video games discussion. Not that any actual action was made, given that this was very late in his term and he was voted out of office, but that's not to say that the topic will stay in 2019 if videos like these get some traction even if it's out of context. Politicians aren't blind, they can see what trends on the internet just like you. So I implore you to take a moment to look for yourself at what the conversations are for this topic and see if it's going to be one that can handle this type of discussion, because I don't see it going very well if this is the current conversation we're having.